More than 100 days have passed since Tokyo's trade curbs triggered the South Korea-Japan trade spat. The Japanese government is adamantly keeping its initial stance. Following a statement during the parliamentary session on October 4th, Japanese Prime Minister Shinzo Abe reiterated 4 days later that South Korea is responsible for normalizing the frayed bilateral ties and needs to comply with the international law.
韓国は重要な隣国であります。国際法に基づき国との約束を遵守することを求めたいと思います。
Japan previously stressed how the South Korean Supreme Court's ruling on forced labor issues had violated the Basic Relations Treaty signed by the two nations in 1965. Tokyo has previously said it could take this matter to the International Court of Justice. For that, it is to be seen how the two nations are interpreting the 1965 pact differently. In today's episode of The Point, we will take a deep dive into the fraying South Korea-Japan ties with experts.
Hello, welcome to The Point. I'm your host, Daniel Chen. Various sectors in Japan are affected by the ongoing boycott movement here in South Korea. Will the Abe administration continue to remain oblivious to the losses experienced by these local industries and keep the trade conflict going? We'll turn to a number of experts from inside and outside of the nation for their take on the matter. So, let's get to the point. To help us dissect today's topic into digestible bites, we're joined in the studio by Professor Yang Jun-seok from Catholic University of Korea. Thank you so much for being here with us.
Happy to be here.
Well, first of all, Prime Minister Shinzo Abe on October 4th said Korea is an important neighbor. It should abide by agreements. Then he reiterated similar points at the parliament. What do you make of his recent remarks?
Okay, well, that still says that Japan still considers Korea an important problem, friend, problematic neighbor, but still it shows that Korea is important to Japan, which I think is a good thing. It also shows that Prime Minister Abe has not changed his point of view on Korea, so that probably signals that problem will continue to go on, probably until Prime Minister Abe steps down from the position of the Prime Minister.
Right, the Japanese leader seems to point out that Seoul Supreme Court ruling on forced labor issue violated the 1965 treaty. So he appears fixated on wanting the South Korean government to intervene that ruling.
Okay, well, my understanding is that previously this difference in the interpretation of the treaty has actually lasted a long time. Even though there are some elements in Japan which agrees with the Korean interpretation, the political party or the affiliated parties that Prime Minister Abe leads has an alternate interpretation of the treaty, and they've been sticking with it for quite some time. Now, the previous Korean administrations and the previous Japanese administrations have sort of worked around this. I think either the Korean government paid much of the required payments, or Japanese government or companies, private companies paid much of the required payments without acknowledging the interpretation of the treaty. So I think both sides got really used to sort of bypassing the problem, and then there was the Korean Supreme Court ruling which dealt with this directly, and that I think it was sort of the spark that's lit this whole problem.
Well, we're going to extend our conversation to another special guest from outside of the nation. It seems South Korea and Japan differ on their interpretation of the 1965 treaty. How would legal experts from a third party view the situation? We have Timothy Webster, Associate Professor of Law at Western New England University, joining us via Skype. Welcome to the program, Timothy.
Hello, delighted to be here, and I'd like to thank Arirang Broadcasting for the opportunity to appear today.
We are grateful for your presence as well. Seoul's top court made the ruling last October based on the idea that the forced labor victims have individual rights to sue Japanese firms for compensation. In spite of signing the treaty, does a nation have the authority to prevent individual rights to reparation?
When people have brought similar World War II era claims in the United States, for example, or in France or in Germany, those courts have decided that the individual right to seek reparation was resolved or when the treaties were signed between the two different countries. There's also a decision from the International Court of Justice called the Jurisdictional Immunities case that came down in 2012, where an individual Italian sued the German government, and the ICJ said sovereign immunity, meaning Germany is immune from such claims, means that the individual right to reparation cannot be recognized. So when you look at cases that are most parallel to the Supreme Court decision from South Korea, I think most courts would say that countries can do this and countries have done this. Now, it may be possible to look for an individual right in other fields of law. Right, so we're talking specifically about the issue of humanitarian law, the law that applies when war is ongoing. But if you look at other areas of law that might be at stake here, for example, international investment law, right, because you have Japanese corporations investing in Korea. If you look at international human rights law, I think you will see greater acceptance of this idea that an individual has the right to seek reparations from a government. So, as with all things in the law, there are different interpretations you can use that will help one cause or hurt a particular cause.
Right, and Japan said it wants to take the conflicting interpretation of the treaty through the International Court of Justice. Have there been cases where two sides got into a legal dispute by understanding the agreement differently? And how likely is it that the ICJ will handle this particular case?
Sure. So I'll respond to that in a couple of ways. First of all, the International Court of Justice only hears cases between two countries, right? And in this particular case, the Supreme Court forced labor decision, we have Korean citizens and Japanese corporations, neither of which is a state, right? So in the typical ICJ case, you have Korea and Japan, or America and Canada, or Germany and Italy, two countries litigating against each other. The other way of responding to this is to talk about that decision I just mentioned, the Farini decision, where the International Court of Justice looked at a case similar to this and said, again, it wasn't completely the same. It was an individual against a state, right? And those are different. Those are different kinds of cases.
Professor Webster, should South Korea and Japan take this matter to the ICJ? What are the steps of the dispute settlement?
Sure. So the first thing that would have to happen is South Korea would have to agree to it. Now, the way the ICJ works is every country can decide whether it wants to appear before it, and every country has the sovereignty to decide, yes, I will, or no, I will not. As it is right now, some states have agreed to what they call, the mandatory jurisdiction of the court. So Japan has already said yes. Right, and many other countries have already said, yes, we agree to this. But other countries, including both South Korea and the United States, have not said yes automatically. And they will say, well, we will appear on a case-by-case basis. Right, so even though Japan has said yes to this by virtue of signing on to the mandatory jurisdiction clause, South Korea has still not done that. So South Korea would still have to decide whether it wants to bring this case before the ICJ.
All right, Professor Webster, thank you for sharing your insights on the matter. We appreciate it.
Well, thank you for the opportunity to appear today. I really learned a lot and look forward to having more conversations with you in the future. Thank you.
We look forward to having you here again, of course. And here in South Korea, the people are upset by Japan's trade curbs, which can easily be seen as a retaliatory measure. More and more citizens are participating in a nationwide boycott of Japanese goods and services. Let's roll a clip to find out how adversely the movement impacted Tokyo's economy.
Japan's economy is taking damages from boycotts carried out by South Koreans who are infuriated by Tokyo's retaliatory export curbs. Data says the number of South Korean travelers that visited Japan in July and August has declined by 30% on year. The slowdown in tourism exchange between Seoul and Tokyo has resulted in Japan seeing its tourism revenue shrink by more than $290 million. That's 9 times bigger than what South Korea had lost due to the tourism cutback. Looking into each industries, the Japanese hospitality sector's revenue was reduced by more than $99 million. Its food service industry, meanwhile, lost more than $85 million of revenue compared to last year. South Korean airliners saw their revenues take a significant amount of dip as well, with fewer travelers heading to Japan. On the other hand, South Korea has seen its revenue increase in tour-related sectors by having 10% more travelers from Japan during the holiday season compared to last year. Korea's wholesale and retail sectors have seen more than $16 million revenue hike on year. Hospitality industries recorded $15 million more revenue than last year, and food and drink service sectors has seen nearly $10 million hike on year. Japanese liquor brands have taken irredeemable damage in the Korean market as well. In September, South Korea imported only $6,000 worth of Japanese beer. Japanese car makers have seen similar results, with their sales dropping 60% on year in September. It is to be seen whether Japan would continue to press South Korea with its export curbs, despite seeing several of its industries being adversely affected by boycotts.
So less South Koreans are traveling to Japan. Apparently, the economic impact in Japan is about 9 times bigger or stronger than the ones we're experiencing here in the nation. The tourism sector there must be hit hard.
Well, Koreans were the second largest tourist to Japan before the boycott. Next to the Chinese, in terms of both population, number of people who visited Japan, as well as the amount of money that was spent in Japan, Korea was ranked second, and Korean tourism was very strong factor for economies of some small and medium-sized cities. Now, if you talk about the effect of tourism on the Japanese GDP as a whole, it's not that much. The amount that Koreans spent in Japan was perhaps 0.1% of the Japanese GDP. But on selected cities, those effects are quite important, because in some of the smaller cities that are depending on tourism, Koreans were the major customers for businesses in their cities. Now, Hyundai Economic Research Institute did a study, and as you mentioned, it seems like Japan got 9 times the damage that Korea did in terms of tourism. The way to interpret that is, well, because Koreans are not visiting Japan, their lodging sector, their retail sector, their restaurants, they've all took a hit. Korean businesses took hit as well, especially the tourist agencies and airlines. But if you look at the damage that Korean firms took from the Japanese boycott and the damage that the Japanese firms took from the boycott, Japan's businesses took 9 times the damage as the Korean businesses. So the way that the Hyundai Economic Research Institute interprets these type of damages, Japan right now is receiving most of the damages, so a boycott seems to be effective, especially for smaller towns. As I mentioned, the damage to Japan is estimated to be about 350 billion won. That's about $290 million. For some of the small and medium-sized cities, that may be very important. Korean firms are also taking some damages because they're not getting reservations, they're not getting airline seats. Hyundai Research Institute believes that this boycott may not be an effective long-term strategy, but as a short-term measure, it seems to be working fairly well.
Right. To zoom in on some of the specific regions that's adversely affected by the boycott, it's Tsushima Island. It's one of favorite spots for Koreans, especially fishing, I believe. 80% of foreign visitors there are Korean. So how adversely affected, for instance, for Tsushima Island, their hospitality and tourism industries?
Well, they're very hard hit. A lot of their business have seen very few or no customers at all. So that's one area where they actually want Koreans back very quickly. And I think Prime Minister Abe is feeling the heat from those cities. We've had similar things in Korea, actually, when China retaliated against Korean tourism for the placement of the THAAD weaponry. Korean businesses have felt this type of damage as well. If you look at the entire Korean business, Korean GDP, that tourism retaliation really didn't hurt Korea very much, but on selected industries and selected areas, it had a major hit, so it had a major political consequence, and that seems to be what's happening in Japan as well.
For the products and services available in Korea, let's take a look at beer. It used to be Japanese beer. It was arguably the most popular brand in Korea, but now it's dipped down all the way to 28th on that list after the trade conflict between the two sides. And Japanese car makers, they're suffering here as well. The brands are experiencing a similar dilemma, but apparently some of the officials said they don't plan to move out of Korea because it's an important market. But are we reaching a point where these companies might not be able to make a rebound?
Okay, well, Korea had boycotts of these Japanese goods before when there were problems in Dokdo Island or when there were problems when Japan misrepresented Japanese occupation in their textbooks. So these type of boycotts, retaliations have taken place before, but usually they didn't last long. When this boycott started, a lot of Japanese businesses, I think, thought that, well, we'll weather this for about 6 months to a year, things will get back to normal. The problem is it's not really stopping as quickly as Japanese businesses thought, and this has a possibility of extending for a long period of time because, well, if Japan places additional goods on their prohibited list, if Japan puts more goods that Korean businesses or Japanese exporters have to get licenses for, then this boycott will explode again. So there's always a potential that even if the problem seems to be reducing, if government makes one particular move, it'll explode again. So I think that's what's perhaps making the Japanese companies a bit nervous. If they thought that this boycott was going to be permanent, they may move out. And again, in terms of sheer economic value, well, Korean imports of consumer goods from Japan is less than 10% of the total imports. But still, the Japanese companies, I think, are watching out on whether this boycott will be for an extended period of time. And that, in a lot of ways, depend on what the Japanese government's response will be.
Hoping for the best, but bracing for more sour pills to swallow seems to be the playbook for the Japanese firms. Now let us extend our conversation to another special guest that's joining us from outside of the nation. Time to see how a global economist is viewing this situation. Wakas Adenwala, Asia analyst at the Economist Intelligence Unit, is connected via Skype. Hello, Wakas.
Hello, thank you so much for having me at the show.
It's a pleasure to have you with us again. The South Korean boycott of Japanese goods has resulted in a drastic dip in sales of Japanese cars and beer. As an economic expert in the same region, do you expect the movement to last for more than 3 months? And what do the numbers indicate?
Unfortunately, yes, I do expect the boycott will extend for a few more months, beyond 3 months actually, because the sentiments are unlikely to fade away so soon. It impacts a lot of people who feel still antagonized by Japan's actions, from the semiconductor tightening bans on exports from July, and then obviously the removal from the whitelist. And also the fact that obviously a lot of people harbor negative sentiments from the colonial history from Japan as well.
So Japan missed out on $300 million in revenues from falling South Korean travelers in July and August. What does this data indicate in terms of the bilateral conflict?
Obviously, it's bad in the sense that obviously people-to-people contact is going to reduce as well. The governments have in tradition not been very good allies. Obviously, they have had their disagreements, but the people-to-people contact were obviously improving through tourism. They were improving through media contacts. They were obviously improving through business contacts. If tourism falls out, obviously they'll see a fall in trade links as well. Obviously, it impacts a lot of other sectors too, such as retail. Obviously, Japan on its own is suffering from the fall in tourism numbers from South Korea. But do bear in mind that this is the Rugby World Cup season. So the impact, if it drags on beyond this, will be worse from lower South Koreans visiting. But as of now, Japan itself has been welcoming a lot of global tourists from the whole world. So it's not a big concern from Japanese perspective as such, for now at least.
Mr. Adenwala, some Korean sectors are also affected by the trade spat. Some experts are concerned that bilateral conflict is adding to the more uncertainty in regional and world economies. Do you feel the same way?
Yes, it's not just consumer sectors, but it's also more about how those consumer sectors, especially to the technology side, are not doing well. South Korea is obviously something known as a power hub for semiconductor industry. It's not just a hits there, but it's obviously a lot of other sectors that were hit after being removed from the whitelist, because around 1,100 goods and more were impacted by Japan's decision. Japan and South Korea are one of the world's biggest economies. They're both part of G20. So obviously a trade row between these two has implications on the global supply chain. The rest of the world obviously is not seeing the impact as immediately. The rest of the world obviously does not track the protests in South Korea and Japan or the sentiment as closely. But obviously when potentially prices of smartphones will go up, they will feel the impact more closely in that sense. The technology sector beyond semiconductors too, obviously. So that's a big concern for the rest of the technology sector participants in other parts of the world too.
All right, thank you so much, Wakas, for your time and your expertise. We appreciate it.
Thank you so much for having me on the show, and have a good day.
You too. Now, coming back to you, Professor Young, people in the Japanese tourism industry and exporters are certainly hoping this will all die down soon, the conflict between the two sides. But judging by Abe's recent remarks, however, it's indicative that it's an unlikely scenario.
Well, I think Prime Minister Abe has put too much political chips in this Korean pressure in terms of Japanese politics. However, I think it's very illuminating that Japan has not put any more items on the prohibited list. Japan has put 3 items in the prohibited list, so every time Korean firms want to import that, Japanese firms which export those 3 chemicals have to get permission from the Japanese government, and Japan has put Korea off the white list. So now Korea can only get sensitive items from pre-certified Japanese firms. But besides that, Japan has not placed any more goods on the prohibited list, which Koreans were really concerned about. They have not placed additional measures that Japan could have put on, which Korea was very worried about. And I think part of the reason is because Prime Minister Abe is feeling the pressure from his domestic constituency in those small towns, small tourist towns that we were talking about, as well as international pressure. Japan is one of the largest trading countries in the world, so they do not want to be seen as a country which prohibits exports for political purposes. So I think that's keeping some of his policies in check. And I think what he really wants at this point is some kind of resolution over that 1965 pact. But I think Koreans and Japanese are sort of looking past each other on this particular item. Korean government has stated multiple times that Korean government is open to more discussion, negotiations, but in the area of trade. Whereas Japan has given strong signals, it has not explicitly made them clear because, well, then they'll probably lose on the WTO case. But they've given a lot of signals that there will be no negotiations on trade unless there's some kind of resolution on the 1965 pact issue. So on the one side, we're saying we'll only look at one issue, not the other. The other side is saying we have to look at both measures. So they're pretty much talking past each other at this point, at this particular time.
Right, speaking of talking past each other, there are some voices of concern coming from the political realm in Japan. For instance, the new land minister, Kazuyoshi Akaba, said, even called Korea Japan's benefactor. Would these voices from within move the needle a little bit for Prime Minister Shinzo Abe? Okay, well, if it's coming from its own party, like this minister, that may have some effect. But my understanding is that such pro-Korean voice in Prime Minister Abe's own party is very small. There's a substantially large voice from the opposition party, but I don't think Prime Minister Abe will pay a lot of attention to the opposition party because, well, he's just won an election. So I think at least on the political side, it's not going to be that much of a help. And what's really alarming is more than 60% of the Japanese public seem to favor a tougher stance on Korea in this matter. And that is
a lot more worrying because that means Prime Minister Abe has the domestic political support from the people. And also, I think it's a bit of a diplomatic failure because, well, a lot of those Japanese people, especially the young people, just 5 years ago had very favorable view on Korea. So it seems that within about 5 years, that sentiment changed. And I think that is, well, it's partially the fault of Japanese government, I think, because they've been putting a lot of sort of propaganda saying that Korea is wrong in this case, but also sort of failure on Korea's diplomatic efforts because, well, we had an opportunity to turn the sentiment on the younger Japanese people who really like Korean culture, Korean music, Korean food, and we seem to have missed that opportunity.
Right, bottom-up approach could be good in terms of this very tense situation between two sides. But unfortunately, Korea and Japan are having a hard time boosting bilateral exchanges, even public and private exchanges.
Well, I think it's a good thing that at least the business people seems to be talking. And I think if there's a key to all this, it'll be businesses because it's the businesses of both sides which are taking the hit. Now, regular people in both Korea and Japan, they may be sacrificing a little bit, but you know, they're just switching one brand of beer for the other. So it's not a major sacrifice, but it is the businesses who are going to be really hurt by this, both Japanese businesses and Korean businesses. And luckily, the businesses also have the ears of the government as well as the National Assembly and Japanese Diet. So I think if there's any kind of hope, it'll have to come from the business sector, emphasizing that both Korea and Japan are getting hurt by this and the damage is substantial and we have to come up with a solution. And I would look at the business sector to start hopefully lead the reconciliation process. I think right now they're probably one of the few hopes that we have of resolving this mess before it gets even more serious.
Right. Unfortunately, we have run out of time. Professor Yang Jun-seok, we appreciate you coming in and making our program complete today.
Thank you.
There's a lack of historic remorse. Japan was at the forefront of the colonial era. Both Japanese politicians and media aimed at Abe's firm stance against Korea. Perhaps the PM should lend a more attentive ear to his critics before pushing the bilateral conflict into a deeper crisis. That's all we have for you at this hour. Do join us again same time next week for a brand new episode of The Point. Thank you for watching.